All right, welcome everyone. I'm very excited to welcome Ben Fong to the program. I've actually long been a admirer of Ben's writing. He's sort of somebody that writes about things that I think really interest our program in politics and psychoanalytic theory. But one of the things that I really find interesting about Ben's work is this sort of practical uh, attention to the political dynamics in America. Today, I want to open up a conversation on his newest book called Quick Fixes, which is a history of drug use in America from Prohibition to the present. And the book is really interesting. But Ben, can you just sort of, say a bit about your bio, a snapshot of like your research, just so folks get a sense of your background?
Sure. Again, thanks so much for having me. I teach at Arizona State University at the Honors College. It's my main teaching position. I'm also the associate director of the Center for Work and Democracy there. The center actually has a recent podcast project on the history of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which I'm producing and hosting. That's on Jacobin Radio right now. My most recent book is Quick Fixes, Drugs in America from Prohibition to the 21st Century Binge. And this is what we're going to talk about today. I have a lot of different research interests. I write for a bunch of different publications, Jacobin, Damage Magazine, and I've got interests in psychoanalysis, politics, critical theory, lots of different things.
So you write in the book, drug laws, no less than drugs, tend to treat not causes but symptoms. Drugs naturally point beyond themselves to the problems in our lives and to our ways of dealing with them, to greedy and exploitative organizations and institutions, and to a society of growing dysfunction, fear, and misery. So this is a really interesting book because when we talk about drugs, we talk about escape, obviously. And, you're talking about from cigarettes to coffee to opiates to cocaine. You touch it all. Marijuana, everything is brought up, and it's organized by chapters by drug. So what is your do you have a sort of theory of drug use in America? Is there a kind of higher, maybe a higher logic? And can you articulate that?
Sure. There's a trans-historical component to this and a more historically and socially specific one. So the trans-historical bit, like why do we like drugs in general? Well, I think it's fairly obvious, and there's not a ton to say about that component. You look at the history of tobacco, opium poppy, coca cultivation. It's almost always tied to human settlement. Human beings have known for a really long time that drugs are a fantastic adjunct to life. It's not necessarily necessary for our survival, but they sure are good to have around. And so from that angle, I guess I don't have a ton to say. The sort of the benefit, the appeal is pretty obvious, and I think everyone who's used psychoactive substances of any kind sort of like understands the basic appeal. The more historically and socially specific question comes with like why Americans today are taking so many drugs, and the kinds of drugs that they do, and in the ways that they do as well. And these are all really quite odd. So just in terms of the numbers, Americans, we comprise 4 to 5% of the world's population. We consume 80% of its opioids. We consume a bit more than 80% of its ADHD medications. Those are amphetamines and amphetamine-like drugs. And basically in the 21st century in particular, American drug use is really out of control. I mean, the trends are all at historic highs across the board. Just you name the psychoactive substance, we're taking more of it than ever. And all the trends are going up in general as well. And so there's that situation. There's also, the specific justifications we have for psychoactive drug taking and the various kinds of schizoid understandings of different kinds of drugs therein. So, for instance, methamphetamine today is one of the most vilified drugs around, right? Along with fentanyl, I would say. Meth and fentanyl are the two most vilified drugs in the news. Methamphetamine is specifically in its current form. We could get into that in more detail. it's a very deleterious drug to take. It's a serious issue. At the same time, its chemical cousin, amphetamine, is widely prescribed to children all over the United States if as an ADHD medication. And we like to think of these things as radically different, but they're not. I mean, historically, methamphetamine hydrochloride has been used in the same kinds of medications for which amphetamine and dextroamphetamine have been prescribed. These drugs are things that can be used in the sort of like licit pharmaceutical market. But nonetheless, we have this extreme divide between these things, as if one is a perfectly sanctioned substance and the other is some kind of social scourge. So that is also curious, right? Beyond just the wild consumption of Americans, that very strange love-hate affair that Americans bear with drugs, that's also quite peculiar. And I would say also the specific purposes that we use drugs for is quite interesting. I mean, historically, people have used drugs for just straightforward social purposes, or something to stuff in your cheek and just get through the day, right? It gives you a little buzz throughout the day. Some drugs, specifically some psychedelics, are used in religious rituals, whatnot. There's a wide range of ways in which we can use psychoactive drugs, but today, for the most part, drugs are used to used very instrumentally, right? They're either uppers or downers. They're used to get up for the day, to accomplish whatever tasks we need to accomplish. We've got a wide range of stimulants on the market to help us do that. Or they're used to help us wind down at the end of the day, essentially to prepare for the next one. And I think that the way in which recreational drugs are really filtered into a form that allows it to be a leisure drug rather than an all the time drug, it's really interesting. Just as you see something like psilocybin or LSD being microdosed to essentially form an amphetamine substitute, so too do you see a wide range of drugs that could be taken for long weekend trips, right? Being used in much more instrumental small doses so that it's a couple hours rather than a full experience, right? And so in all these ways, drugs are extremely instrumentalized today. So this is just a sort of a broad description of the different peculiarities of American drug consumption today, and why that is. Sorry, this is a long answer, but you're kind of getting to the heart of the book right off the bat. Why that is, just briefly, and I think we can talk in a lot more detail about the why question. But briefly, I think that there's a unique contradiction in America. On the one hand, it's a fabulously wealthy nation. I think we all know that. That it's a land of dreamers, expectations, ostentatious displays of material wealth that we all are in some sense promised to participate in, even if obviously we don't. On the other hand, it's amongst other industrialized nations, it's fairly unique in not having any kind of countervailing forces to the market. So we don't have a labor party, a socialist party, a workers' party. We don't have a history thereof. We've got a frayed, decaying social safety net. We have weak and historically segmented unions. In all these ways, Americans are sort of just flayed by the market constantly. And so you've got this situation where we're dreaming of great material success while also encountering the absolute hostility of our environment in a capitalist society. And I think that contradiction accounts for the specific stressors on Americans that has led to such fabulous drug use. Now, that's just a sort of general answer. We can get into the more of the historical and social specifics.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I was really struck by so much of your book, and you open up the marijuana section by saying an old hippie saying has it that if pot was made legal, it would stop working. And I really feel that, as somebody who grew up before the internet and grew up before the legalization of marijuana, and of course, as a young boy, dibble dabbled. And when I did, it was super intense. But I couldn't imagine for my children today. I'm actually legitimately afraid of this, of what it would mean for them to go take their first puff, given how strong it is, right? So that's something I want to look at, and the way in which the potency of some of these drugs when they become recreationalized, and how that is looking for you. But before we get to some of the more contemporary, let's turn to history if we could. I wanted to get a sense from you um, about starting first with the role of the state. If we could speak perhaps a bit more broadly um, about the role of the state in the kind of maintenance of the consumption of drugs and alcohol in America. Um, is there a sort of overarching theory that you present in the text? How might you sort of share that with our listeners?
Sure. I think the most familiar part of this story concerns the carceral state and the growth of the carceral state since the 1980s. We obviously have a crisis of mass incarceration in the United States. We jail and prison people more than any other country. That's something that's widely known. And oftentimes, the war on drugs is seen as the precipitator of that, or at least as a key factor therein. And it's very important, there's no doubt about it. I think the numbers, it's something like one-fifth of people who are incarcerated, are in for nonviolent drug offenses. It's not quite as much as you might imagine, right? But it's still a lot of people, right? 20% of people in for, again, nonviolent drug offenses. Um, but part of the difficulty here is in the way in which the state reports numbers. And so, when you get prison statistics, they don't list all the offenses that people are in for. They list the most violent offense, right? And so if someone has murdered someone, for instance, that is the statistic, that's the category that they're listed under. They might also have some kind of drug charge involved as well, but we only know that through somewhat informal surveys given to prisoners. I've emailed with the Prison Policy Institute about this. It's actually kind of a quandary, right? Just how much has the war on drugs contributed to mass incarceration? There's clear ways in which it has, but we actually don't know the full extent of it. You look at the numbers. Most people are in for some kind of violent crime, right? But to what extent does that have to do with the drug trade? You'd have to do a lot more research to figure out exactly how. In any event, I think that's the story that most people know, right? The way in which the punitive state and a paradigm of punitive prohibition has unnecessarily vilified psychoactive substances, sometimes in completely irrational ways, that has led to this ballooning of the carceral system. That's one way, but I think that the state is much more intimately involved in the other side of the equation too, which is the production and distribution of drugs. And I mean this both in the legal licit sense and the illegal illicit sense. So, starting with the former, during the Second World War, members of the Office of Strategic Services, which is the precursor to the CIA, they became very convinced that controlling international drug flows was an extreme security concern. That if the United States could not only control the different flows of drugs, psychoactive drugs, but just like drugs in general, around the world, and not only that, but control their precursor chemicals as well, then that would be a source of great power. And so Harry Anslinger, who was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics for like 30 years, I think 1930 to 1962. He was a member of the OSS. He was friends with a lot of the OSS people, and and it was very clear to a lot of them that this was a key priority. And so in the post World War period, they really did spend a lot of time gaining control over those flows. It's one of the reasons why we have a uniquely profitable pharmaceutical industry today in the United States, one that is very much tied to state regulatory processes. You don't get big pharma without that initial investment from Anslinger and others, and also the intimate relation not only between the Food and Drug Administration, but also the DEA as well. There's very close interaction between all those agencies and big pharmaceutical companies. Um, there's also the illicit side as well. And this story has been told in, Alfred McCoy's The Politics of Heroin and many other places. The basic template is quite simple. The CIA often funded anti-communist insurgencies by allowing different groups around the world to grow poppies and distribute heroin. Sometimes they even chartered airplanes in order to fly drugs for different so-called cartels. In any event, they oftentimes turned away from or ignored different forms of drug production around the world so that these different groups could fund themselves. And this happened in Italy, it happened in France, it happened in Southeast Asia, it happened in Afghanistan, right? Like the same kind of template over and over again. The CIA was involved in funding or helping groups fund themselves by helping them essentially grow and distribute heroin, cocaine, lots of other drugs. Yeah, so those are the different ways in which the state is involved. I mean, it's a complicated story, but really on both
Can I ask
sides of the
a follow-up
equation.
on that?
Yeah,
So,
please.
so is the logic partially the pacification of a certain underclass, and there's a racial dimension to that. This notion in Marxist theory of what we call surplus populations, or sort of populations on the margins of integration into formal wage labor, right? Which is a major reality of a lot of inner cities, especially with these laws that prevent people from, say, getting a job at Walmart if they have a felony, right? I think it's only 13 states that allow people to actually get a job at a mainstream place if you have a felony. Is that part of this? A kind of pacification of elements of the working class? Like, what's the interest? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's right. There are a lot of different interests, I should say first. Um, One of the consistent features about drug policy and drug rhetoric in the United States is that um, whenever it comes to the fore, typically some specific social group is being targeted in the discourse or the policy. And so one orienting claim of the book is that anytime that people are talking about drugs in the abstract, right, it's a really unhelpful category at the end of the day. Not only because it lumps together psychoactive and non-psychoactive medications, it also lumps together psychoactive drugs that oftentimes are very disparate in their effects, right? Drugs in general, it's a pretty bad category, but it's a useful category for a lot of people because it's a convenient way of scapegoating, of talking about different social ills without actually naming the thing itself. That's just been a consistent feature. So, and this is oftentimes, as you intuit, oftentimes carried out in explicitly racialized ways. So, you look at the big drug scares throughout American history. It's always been the case with opium and the Chinese in the late 19th century, with cocaine and black stevedores in the 1910s, with Mexicans and marijuana in the 1930s. It's just been a consistent feature of American history. Like anytime you get these big drug scares, there's one typically already socially oppressed and marginalized group that is in the crosshairs. Um, Sometimes this is coded in ways that we don't think about in explicitly racial terms, or have to do with ethnic divisions that are no longer salient today in the way that they were. And so in the late 19th century, at the same time that you had the problem of the so-called yellow peril on the West Coast, right, and all these opium dens and white women going into opium dens and being seduced by the vicious Chinese, all this stuff. At the same time that you had that, you had this equally vicious discourse about immigrant Catholic men and saloons in big cities, and that division between what was at the time called old stock Americans or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants today, and more recent immigrants, Irish, Italians, etc. We don't tend to think of that as quite as vicious, but it was at that time, and that kind of anti-ethnic prejudice was very salient at that point. So no, it's a constant throughout American drug history.
And so your argument is that the state has an interest in perpetuating these mythologies that latch onto, in a stereotypical way, some notion that like a particular drug is both literally being targeted to a particular ethnic group, but there's an interest in kind of making that almost hyperbolic or kind of feeding on that mythology or something like this. Like, what's do you see my point? Like,
Yeah, I mean,
what accounts for that?
I would say it's the state. I mean, we'd have to quickly get into a theory of the state and why a state does what it does. I would say that that pressure and that the scaremongering and hysteria around different drugs in America, it's just as much a product of civil society. And so if you look at the forces that gathered, the temperance forces, for instance, in the late 19th century, that resulted not only in alcohol prohibition from 1920 to 1933, but also the first American domestic drug controls, 1914, the Harrison Act. This was the first time we controlled opium and cocaine. What led to that? It wasn't just the state blaming marginalized like immigrants and racial groups. It was strong civil society organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League pressuring politicians in a certain direction. And part of my claim for that particular period, but I would say it could be generalized in a number of ways, is that um, part of what you saw at that point was a moral response to the social ills that industrial capitalism had unleashed. You saw similar responses in Europe, but that oftentimes took the form of a workers' party or a socialist party, a properly political vehicle that allowed for broader social reforms to be to be at play. In the United States, we didn't get that for a variety of reasons. The specifics of the political system, just the ruthlessness and brutality of the capitalist class. There's a lot of different reasons why we didn't get that countervailing force. But in the absence of it, in the absence of a real political vehicle that would mitigate the worst effects of industrial capitalism, I think what you got was a lot of people coalescing around a moral response to capitalism. And
Mm,
you read the anti-saloon reformers, and you read members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and stuff like that, and it's pretty clear that they've got a broader social critique in mind, right? They're latched on to alcohol in particular. They're latched on um, the place of the saloon in particular.
mm,
But
mm,
the saloon's is a very particular historical product. I mean, saloons, really begin to. I mean, saloons as opposed to sort of the old colonial tavern, they really begin to become a feature with rapid urbanization in the postbellum period. And so, the saloon itself and the forms of problem drinking that it allowed were really both products of industrial capitalism. And so when reformers, took that in their crosshairs, they had this broader social critique, but no political vehicle for it to express itself in.
So one way to understand that point would be that the development of socialist and working class culture and organizations and parties would mitigate the negative effects of industrialization and the sort of brutalism that's imposed on workers. Because, and here I want to now move into your understanding of alcohol and alcohol consumption, because alcohol consumption, as you articulate, is so bound up with the history of U.S. labor. And I want to invite you to talk about that history, because I was so shocked at how intimate alcohol is tied to the problem of work, and sort of always has been. And it's sort of a dialectic. I mean, it's like it's amazing. And of course, Americans are known for excessive alcohol consumption, and I guess always have been. And so, is your argument that our notoriety in that department really can be tied back to this absence of so both welfare policies that would remediate and offer leisure for workers, as well as the absence of socialist parties that would also do that? Because the natural conclusion from that, of course, is that socialism can help to moderate, perhaps, or mitigate the excessiveness involved with alcohol. That's another point. But tell us about sort of alcohol in relationship to U.S. labor history.
Great. And just quickly, I think that's essentially right. And if you're trying to make, and this is not a totally novel claim in the book, but it is a claim that could be contested. If you look at temperance movements and prohibition efforts in Europe, for instance, there's some success there, right? There are more limited experiments, especially during World War One, with prohibition, albeit oftentimes in more limited form than it was enacted in the U.S. But there is nothing on the scale of the 13-year experiment in the United States, right? We banned alcohol, a substance that Americans absolutely love, and we banned it for 13 years. That is a completely wild situation. And it demands some kind of historical explanation, right? Like why us? And that's essentially the claim, right? Without the development of some kind of countervailing force to mitigate the effects of the market, I think that's essentially why we get the intense investment in moral solutions. I mean, you read the discourse of the temperance reformers, it's like it's from a completely different world. I mean, it's really there is a temperance cause in America today, and a national one as well. But it's not something that's it's not something that's about to take over the United States, right? It's I think the kind of rhetoric and paternalism of the temperance movement is completely foreign today, and that's because it was bound up in a particular time where they were dealing with social ills that we're not dealing with in the same particular form today. So anyhow, you talk about the dialectic of alcohol, and I do sort of set up the chapter there. I probably overused the concept and the term in the book, but yeah, it's sort of that, right? You see a positive moment of alcohol consumption in, say, the early 19th century. Actually, the early 19th century was the highest point of alcohol consumption throughout American history. So, roughly 1790 to 1830, people were drinking, it's estimated, about 4 times more per capita than we're drinking today. So, Americans drink a lot today. But at that point in the early 19th century, it was just kind of out of control. And part of that was that alcohol was imbued in everyday activities. People would have beer with breakfast. There weren't the same kinds of prohibitions on kids drinking, and so kids would drink alcohol at a much earlier age. It was just sort of flowed with the rhythms of the day. Right? You'd have alcohol, but it wasn't this kind of concentrated drinking at night. It was more just something that was just a beverage that was available all the time. And part of this had to do with the fact that there wasn't reliably potable water around. Oftentimes, it was actually people often saw teetotalers, people who said that you shouldn't drink alcohol at all. They saw them as kind of reckless zealots, right? They knew that, like, if you just went out and drank the water, that was a good way to get cholera or get sick by some other means, right? And so, actually, sometimes insurance companies would not insure teetotalers because they thought they were too reckless with their health. It was only in the mid 19th century that you get this reliably potable water, specifically in urban areas, and that claim that you can drink, like, not drink alcohol, right? Not just avoid spirits, but actually just avoid beer and wine altogether. That claim became technologically possible, you could say, in the mid 19th century with the arrival of reliably potable water. Early 19th century, this is a time of maximum alcohol use. There's a history of the period called the Alcoholic Republic. I think it captures the age right pretty well. And the negative moment in the dialectic comes really with postbellum industrialization, and you finally get the formation of a national temperance movement. There had been these more limited experiments, oftentimes sort of religiously, evangelically motivated experiments with temperance, but it never really taken off. And it's only really with industrialization that you get, um, again, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, and these very powerful lobbying organizations that finally pushed over the hump. And then, you get Prohibition from 1920 to 1933. And again, it's a fairly remarkable experiment. I think, knowing Americans' relationship to alcohol, it again should strike everyone as just one of the oddest things about American history, that we banned this substance that we absolutely love for 13 years. Um, Prohibition was effective in some ways. I mean, it was the generally agreed to be the lowest point of alcohol consumption per capita in American history. And so the reformers looked at it and they said, hey, we did our job. Um, the specific culture of male drinking was broken as well.
Mm,
This was a target of the reformers' ire. It was the fact that men, particularly immigrant Catholic men, Irish Italians, would go to the saloon after work and just get hammered, and that offended the sensibility of the middle classes. But the fact that it was men in particular
mm,
was very much at issue. And that was broken. When you got the speakeasies and the different kinds of establishments that would risk serving alcohol in the 1920s, it was oftentimes a co-ed affair. And so that specific culture was broken. So in some ways, prohibition, you could say, was a positive development. In other ways, it was a terror. There's a recent book by the historian Lisa McGurr called the War on Alcohol, and she basically argues that prohibition was a precursor to the war on drugs. And you saw this specifically with the way in which the Bureau of Prohibition targeted Black people, it targeted immigrants, it targeted lower class people, just as the war on drugs has. You also saw this in a very straightforward institutional continuity as well. A lot of the officers and leaders of the Bureau of Prohibition, when that closed, went straight over to the Bureau of Narcotics. So there's a direct connection there as well. And of course, as much as it lowered overall alcohol consumption, prohibition didn't eliminate alcohol itself, and people kept drinking. They often drank dangerous things. So there was this chemical compound used in photography that was added to this thing called Jamaican ginger extract. And people found out that it had a particularly high alcohol content, even though it was extremely poisonous, and they'd drink it anyway, right? And it's estimated that something like 50,000 people were paralyzed for life. They got what was called Jake leg as a result of drinking this stuff. And it was just a kind of visibly degrading way to go about things, right? Instead of just having beers, good alcohol with friends, you just found people sneaking alcohol out of sight and doing all sorts of dangerous things with their bodies as a result. You know, Paradoxically, all the same kinds of ills we associate with the war on drugs.
yeah.
Um, so that's the negative moment, right? And in 33, after we repeal prohibition, the New Deal, you could say, delivers on some of the material promises of the temperance reformers. It actually does the thing that temperance reformers had promised, and so we get this new age of prosperity in America. And alcohol sort of settles into this middle ground, right? Alcohol consumption basically since then has been pretty even. It's gone up
Mm,
and down here and there, but it hasn't changed that much since the 1940s, basically.
mm,
Um, and in the but obviously we needed to figure out some way of dealing with problem drinking, and so this is a moment where in the book, I argue that there's a switch from substance to subject. So instead of demon rum, you get the alcoholic as the target of reformers'
yeah.
ire. And so, it becomes something that's very moralized at first and then later medicalized. But the basic idea is that we have to make people responsible for their own problem drinking if we're going to allow what everyone recognizes to be a quite dangerous substance to be a legal one in American society.
I want to ask you about Alcoholics Anonymous briefly, if I could. I mean, it's so interesting that one of the most you know iconic books of the 1990s, Infinite Jest, is centered around an Alcoholics Anonymous community, and it's also interesting to me that Alcoholics Anonymous something has like a 13% success rate, maybe even lower. Um, what did you discover about AA in your research? Like what's noteworthy about AA, even like from its historical evolution to now? Anything worth mentioning there?
I mean, there's a few different elements there. I didn't do that deep a dive on it. The alcohol chapter was like one of the longer ones as it was, and so I had to kind of breeze through the AA discussion a little bit. Um, it has, one of the things that it's constantly criticized for is that it has quasi-religious roots, and that's true. And so, the explicitly moral framework for what is oftentimes today thought of as a medical issue, right? A form of disease. That's an issue that a lot of people bring up, that like we're using this explicitly, or what was at the time explicitly a religious framework for treating something that we ought to be treating more with a more medical paradigm. So that's one criticism. Again, I would say the main thing is that the reason that AA caught on, despite its shortcomings, is that it offered a framework for understanding the problems of alcohol that weren't attached to alcohol itself. And so, if you look at like what the big brewers and other alcohol companies were doing at this time, they were very invested in this process. They understood that despite the fact that prohibition was repealed, they still had a pretty bad reputation. I mean, part of what allowed prohibition to be passed in the first place is the fact that, part of this was patriotism with the First World War, but the German brewers had a pretty bad reputation. Those big ones, Miller, Schlitz, Busch, like all the big, brewing industrialists of the late 19th, early 20th century, they had a really bad reputation. And so whatever lobbying power they bore going into the 20s was invalidated by the war and just, people's hatred of them. And so they understood that they had a PR campaign to win, and they needed to invest in, so they invested a lot in advertising, in making sure that people understood beer, in particular, to be just a facet of American life, right? Something that went along with good middle class values. Spent a lot of money on that. And they spent a lot of money on different experiments, different advocacy groups, different forms of conceptualizing alcohol consumption that drew attention away from the substance itself. And so, AA provided a very convenient paradigm for understanding the problem alcoholic, right, as involved in some broader moral, quasi spiritual journey of recovery. And that was a convenient way of distracting from the substance itself. I should also say, like, one interesting thing about AA that is not discussed as much. So you oftentimes hear the critique of the religious roots of AA. Um, One of the founders, I'm forgetting his name now, also was very invested in LSD as a way to overcome alcoholism. So there was a big culture of the sort of psychotherapeutics of psychedelics in the 50s, and he was like, this works, right? This therapy helps people overcome alcoholism. But that part, as you can imagine, was kind of muted in the AA history because they didn't want it to come out that one of the founders was pushing LSD.
Hmm. Fascinating. So I really found the marijuana section of great interest, and in part because I grew up on the West Coast, and but I grew up on the West Coast way before legalization, and so I go back home, and now I live on the East Coast. I go back home to Oregon, and it's just like just incredible how much it's changed the economy. People in Colorado, it's just changed everything, right? The legalization movement has, and so I want to get a sense of, and of course we know the sort of weird and cockamamie kind of propaganda that was used during like the Red Scare against marijuana and pot, and how that kind of coalesced with a critique of the left and a critique of the hippies and things of that nature. Could you give us a bit of a overview of how we've gotten to this place with weed, where we're at today, perhaps, and sort of how the state has seen marijuana, perhaps, if that could be, if you don't mind summarizing that, because I really think it's an important story.
Yeah, so I mean, marijuana came to national prominence roughly in the 30s. There's various reasons why. One theory that I'm prone to believe and to emphasize is that Harry Anslinger's Federal Bureau of Narcotics was in danger of having its budget cut. People didn't see the use in this, in having another sprawling enforcement agency alongside other sprawling enforcement agencies. And so they needed something to do. And so Anslinger, along with many others, participated in what was called like the Reefer Madness Scare. So you can look up, movie posters and different pamphlets from the time. And it's, frankly hilarious, like looking back at the kinds of things that were claimed of marijuana. Like people were saying that just one puff and you would fly off into an axe murdering spree or something like that, right? Just wild stories about marijuana being told. And part of the reason that these things were accepted, or at least that people didn't question too much, is that it was a fairly unfamiliar drug to most people. If people had associations with it at all, it was with Mexican migrants. There had been a big influx of Mexican migration from roughly 1915 to 1930. And so, when it had associations at all, it was with Mexicans. So again, to point back to the sort of racialized story that's a constant feature of American drug history. Um, but it also just didn't have associations for a lot of people. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really funny, frankly, just to hear all these stories.
The
And
Cheech and Chong stereotype, you may remember. I remember
yeah,
that from the 80s and 90s, right?
so by
Uh,
the time the sort of like countercultural 60s roll around, and all of a sudden the youth are sort of rediscovering marijuana, and they look back at the reefer madness campaigns of the 30s and 40s, and they're like, wait, what's going on? This drug, this ultimately quite harmless drug that anyone can grow in their backyard, this is the thing that you said we're gonna, like, make us all fly off into axe murdering sprees? Like, this is insane. So part of what you could say, I mean, it's a small part, but part of what fueled the countercultural ethos and the idea that the state was just some maniacal machination, is the fact that, like, they could point to that kind of stuff and say that's an obvious lie, right? That Anslinger and others participated in. And so, it was youthful rebellion against the drugs of adults at the period, but it was also youthful rebellion against the lies of the state as well. And so, marijuana has this countercultural history through the 60s and 70s. Many people thought it was going to be legalized in the 70s. At that point, people were like, this is shown to be pretty harmless, especially in comparison to alcohol. So why not? I think something like 12 states had decriminalized during the 1970s. And then you get the 80s and the Reagan drug scares and all this stuff, and different stories about how, marijuana cooks your brain or does whatever. I mean, there's still these stories that you see today. Um, and then finally, you get the present period, which I think is quite different from the 60s embrace of marijuana. Today, it's much more of an intergenerational thing, and so it's not a youth phenomenon. If anything, the marijuana consumption sort of spans the generations. It's just much more just a feature of American society. And part of that is that marijuana reformers, I think quite smartly, understood that they needed to proceed in steps. And so the first iterations of legalization in the country were for medical marijuana. And a lot of people said, this is an obvious contradiction. There was a time where if you lived in California, like, you could get like a med card pretty easily, right? Without a ton of harassment or anything. And people would point to that and say, well, come on, this is obviously hypocritical. Is this really medicine? Come on. But what the medical marijuana paradigm did do is that it convinced a lot of people that you could smoke marijuana for a long time and that the effects were not that harmful for you. And so in a lot of ways, the medical marijuana movement, despite the fact that it was straightforwardly hypocritical, it kind of paved the way for the recreational legalization of marijuana. And it's very much split along partisan lines today, but in some parts of the country, you can still go to jail for marijuana possession, for simple possession. In a lot of places, it's completely legal, and in fact, almost ubiquitous. It's kind of difficult to avoid the smell of marijuana in a lot of certain sections of American cities. So it's a pretty unique contradiction as far as the potency goes. Um, yeah, there's no doubt about it. Like, people have been working on it like it's the most important science project in contemporary America. Um, I would say that we're actually at a unique moment, a unique technological moment in drug history in a lot of different senses for marijuana, but also for other drugs. And, like what you said at the beginning there, the marijuana of our youth is long gone, and it's a completely different substance. Not only that, but because legal marijuana is oftentimes much more expensive than its illegal counterpart, there is still a very large illegal market. In California, it's estimated that only 25% of the weed sold is actually legal. So the rest of the market, 75%, is still illegally sold.
Right.
Um, so it's not like it's been completely transformed, but in the illegal market, there's all sorts of weird stuff going on. I mean, people are selling oregano with different, like
Right.
K2 sprayed on it and whatnot.
Right.
And so in a lot of
Right.
different ways, it is a kind of scarier moment in psychoactive drugs. Like there was a lot of for all the drug scares of our youth. I went through the DARE program, like a lot of people. For all the scaremongering then, and it's like blowing the drug problem out of proportion. Today, we've actually kind of reached a technological crescendo where a lot of those old fears sort of have some bearing on reality. Like the drugs are just so much stronger today.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
think for that reason, as irrational as it is, I think that we could see the resumption of some kind of like punitive drug warriorism today, precisely because the drugs kind of merit that response.
Yeah. I mean, in Washington, D.C., where I live, it's sort of kind of a half measure, right? They didn't do full legalization. And so what happens is on the street, you can get it, but it's laced. And if you smoke the legal stuff versus the street stuff, you notice a profound difference. And the street weed is very toxic. It's very you just feel it in some sense, and so that actually then becomes a leverage point for lobbyists for legalization, right? To sort of and then they almost have a kind of health holistic argument, right? That we need to sort of bring high quality marijuana to eradicate street weed that could be laced with fentanyl, et cetera, et cetera. What if you think of those arguments as useful? You know what I'm saying? Like the question of like, should Biden do full legalization? Do people demand that? Do people desire that? Could it ever happen in the American South, for example? Um, what do you make of those debates at a policy level?
I think it's so that decision to legalize, and by that people mean deschedule marijuana, or at least like lower the scheduling of marijuana. Right now, marijuana is a Schedule One drug, which means that according to the federal government, marijuana is a drug with absolutely no medical use and one that is extremely dangerous. That's what qualifies as a Schedule One drug, and it's in the same category as LSD and MDMA and heroin. Cocaine's actually Schedule Two; it's one lower than than marijuana. So it's widely recognized that it is irrational, that the official government policy on marijuana at the national level again, it just doesn't make sense of either the drug's harms or its benefits. It's an open secret. I mean, I think that people on both sides of the political spectrum are pretty clear about that. It's one of the more ridiculous features of contemporary American society that it's still viewed that way at the federal level. I think it's really unlikely that Biden or any other Democratic president, I mean, the political moment is unstable, so it's difficult to make predictions. But I think that it's unlikely that any Democrat is going to actually move to deschedule marijuana. Um, for a couple reasons. One, that marijuana is typically a low priority voting issue. So despite the fact that people say yes, you see the polls, yes, most people think that marijuana should be legal, most people think that this is ridiculous, they're not going to vote on marijuana. And so if it's not a decisive thing, they don't need to move on it. And that's the second thing. There's not really much to be gained from doing so right now. in most places where Democrats have an active voting base, marijuana is already legal, right? And people aren't thinking about it as a big problem. It's in places where they don't have that strength that marijuana is still illegal. And so, why they want to push for something that most people don't think is a problem where they live, at least, it's there's not really much incentive to do so, and if they did do so, they would have to live with the enormous political contradiction of a lot of people in prison or jail for, again, nonviolent drug offenses. I mean, the whole issue, the whole contradiction of the history of the war on drugs comes up if you all of a sudden you say, "Oh, marijuana is not this thing that we said it was." Um, I think for all those reasons, despite the fact that I think Democrats are always going to talk the talk on marijuana, it's just a political football that they're willing to, like, punt every time,
Hmm.
because it's not so important to them.
I want to turn to the opioid crisis. Obviously, has its own valence that has mutated in terms of the target groups that are victim or sensitive or succumb to it. And there's been a lot of research on the so-called deaths of despair, and even this notion of former industrial belt, white working class geographic locales, being more victim or succumb to opioid addictions. So, first question is, do you buy that? And what do you make of the thesis of the deaths of despair? And is there a correlation in a reasonable way to the opioid situation, and how does that work out for you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's at least two different questions there. Like, one about the suitability of the analytic framework of deaths of despair, and then one more sort of historical question about whether this is actually how it played out. And with regard to the latter first, um, yeah. So, the way in which so first of all, the development of the opioid crisis was was more widespread, you could say, and had to do with um, the changing paradigm of the treatment of pain in the United States. So there are a lot of developments in the 80s that paved the way for Purdue Pharma first, but eventually a lot of different pharmaceutical companies to profit greatly off of the production of these very addictive opioid medications. Part of this was the introduction of new pain scales into patient forms. Part of this was the development of new disciplines like palliative care and chronic pain management, right? All of a sudden, because of all of these different changes, people began to think of pain not as something that was necessarily part of the curative process, but as something that should be eliminated, that actually doctors had a responsibility to eliminate. And this took a lot of time. I mean, doctors were very resistant to this. Like, they understood that opioids were very addictive, and through the 80s, doctors were extremely reticent to prescribe these things for pain and would oftentimes refer people to physical therapy or give other kinds of medications, or just less addictive medications. And it was only because of these sort of broad paradigm shifts in the treatment of pain that doctors became more open to this, right? So that was the first step. And so I would say it was a development in medicine. It wasn't just about, like, blighted towns in Rust Belt, Ohio, or whatever. Like, this was a broad development. All of a sudden, lots of different people were taking opioid medications. It's across the board. However, there's two things that did make it a more geographically specific phenomenon. And the first thing is that in a lot of places, uh, some doctors without great morals, you could say, opened up what were called pill mills, where they would run practices that were essentially forms of opioid distribution centers. And the companies knew about them. The companies targeted them. In fact, the companies were very specific in saying, like, let's focus on these high production doctors who see people in like 5-minute sessions and are just essentially doling out scripts. and they encouraged that phenomenon. And so you saw the opening up of these pill mills in areas where there wasn't great healthcare in general. And so it was a straightforwardly economic issue. Like, these pill mills opened because they were the cheaper I mean, in a lot of ways this is true of drug consumption more generally. It's the cheaper alternative to actual care, an actual healthcare system. After the pill mills were shuttered, this is 2012, 2013, and the DEA finally started clamping down on these corrupt physicians. Um, you got the introduction of a new kind of heroin trade from Mexico that, and this is documented well in Sam Quinonez's Dreamland. You got new forms of heroin distribution coming from Mexico that specifically avoided the saturated markets, and so they didn't go to the big cities, right? They went to places like Ohio and targeted people who wanted some kind of opioid after having, become addicted to them because of the pill mills or because of other opioid medications they were taking. And so there was this, first with the generation of pill mills, and second with the introduction of heroin to areas of the country that had historically lacked it. It was a very economic story. It was, areas without hospitals, without great healthcare systems, the sort of like blighted, deindustrialized zones of the country. And so there was a very economic story. And again, didn't totally avoid the big cities, but avoided them in some degree because of the pre-existing saturation of the heroin markets in, along like the East Coast, for instance. And so that did make it a more geographically specific phenomenon. All right, so that's a historical and social story. As far as the framework of deaths of despair, I've read some criticisms of it. This is a framework that Ann Case and Angus Deacon, I think they're two Princeton economists, came up with for making sense of the present moment. And the numbers are quite shocking. I think since 2021, there have the numbers of drug and alcohol related deaths have topped 100,000 per year. Where before that it was never higher than 60. Just recently, the last couple of years, it's really gotten out of control. And their framework for making sense of that is deaths of despair. And they lump a few different categories together, but they kind of attribute the main rise in deaths of despair to drug and alcohol consumption. And I don't think it's a terrible framework. I mean, anything that points to social conditions and social factors leading to drug consumption, I'm generally for. And I think that some of their solutions, and I need to read more about them to sort of say for sure here. I think that some of their solutions are sort of locked in a liberal framework that doesn't adequately take into account the broad social transformation we need to address some of these problems, to actually provide healthcare, housing, jobs, the kind of social protections that would mitigate the deaths of despair phenomenon. That being said, I think as an analytic framework, it actually does make sense of the problem pretty well.
Yeah, and Bernie Sanders did, I think, put the concept on the map in a way that was quite, I think, robust and frankly correct. So I mean, I'm in broad agreement with you on that. And there's much to be said on that, but in the interest of because again, this wonderful book you've written is structured by drugs per chapter, and one of the chapters that I absolutely loved, especially as a person that is on the left, committed to socialism and so on, is psychedelics. And so I wanted to actually, so there's much to be said about psychedelics, but could we sort of jump in at the point at which psychedelics and the new left, Timothy Leary and the whole experimentations, tune in, drop out, that whole idea of that period of time, and how psychedelics played into what you refer to as counterculture leftism. And then I have a second question, but give us that story snapshot first, please.
Sure. So psychedelics, you could say, emerged in the United States more in the 50s by various means. I mean, mescaline, for instance, had been a substance that people had known about for some time and experimented with. But it's in the 50s that the CIA takes, again, going back to the state, takes a great interest in LSD as a mind control drug. And they actually got the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly to begin, cracking the formula for LSD. And then when they did, they produced it in what was called tonnage, what they called tonnage quantities. So imagine tons, literal tons of LSD. It was some there
But
was
wait,
some.
wait. LSD. Wait, I don't understand. LSD is like made of paper, right? Kind of like, or kind of
Well, I mean,
in,
it can, you could have a jar of LSD as well. It can come in different forms. So
come in different
oftentimes
form. But how could it be
different
a ton? That
paper
is
was
so much.
soaked. It's a lot. So, sometimes paper is soaked and then little tabs are cut out,
So,
and that's like a
right.
convenient way of dosing it in more precise ways. But I mean, LSD is something that you could take in micrograms, and they were producing it in tonnage quantities. Partially
Wow.
for these new experiments. It was there's one story, supposedly they got like a decimal point wrong in the order, and so that's one of the reasons why there's so much. But in any event, with this vast quantity of LSD, part of it began leaking out into elite circles, and you got people like Henry Luce, the head of Time magazine, his wife Claire Booth Luce, Aldous Huxley, Timothy Leary, like a lot of people in more elite circles. It begins to sneak out, right? They've got friends in the State Department, they've got friends in the CIA. All of a sudden, they're getting access to this thing that blows your mind. Cary Grant, for instance, wrote this, or was interviewed about LSD in the 50s, and was like, I'm happier today than I've ever been in my life because of this substance. It was really an elite phenomenon, and it really began in the 1950s. And then in the 1960s, that elite sort of propaganda around LSD and psilocybin. Psilocybin was also something that was, revealed in various news articles in the 50s as well. People going down to Mexico and trying out mushrooms with different shamans and whatnot. And so a whole bunch of different kinds of psychedelics came to the fore of popular consciousness in the 50s. But it was really only in the 60s that they gained more notoriety in the 60s counterculture. I think in a lot of ways, we sometimes lump together the emergent new left and this drug subculture that was developing. Oftentimes there was a lot of suspicion between these two different groups. There were some people on the new left who thought of, Leary and Kesey and a lot of the different drug subcultures that were sprouting at the time. They thought of those as like a big distraction, right? They thought it was actually like hampering the moment and distracting from political progress. On the other side, people like Leary thought the new left was a complete disaster, right? Leary himself thought that politics just wasn't worth it. He said that, the sort of famous slogan that you just mentioned, it was about dropping out of existing processes and focusing on yourself, on ego dissolution, on coming to new realizations through drug experimentation. So it was explicitly apolitical or sometimes anti-political vision at work. And so sometimes we do too much to confuse these different groups. That being said, I think it's undeniable that drug subcultures were a pretty integral part of the new left. And to my mind, it's really difficult to make sense of the way in which the political visions of the moment sort of really spun out of any contact with reality in a lot of ways. It's really difficult to see that and not tie it in some way to the drug experimentation that was happening at the time. And so it would be way too reductive to say, they were too high to actually formulate a good political vision
Yeah.
at this time. But I think that there's a resonance there. There's a resonance. And I think that despite the fact that there were other reasons for the political maximalism, the extremism, what I would argue is, oftentimes the sort of delusional fantasies of the new left. I think that there's a resonance there with the emerging drug subcultures, even if it wasn't a direct causative story.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, you quote Todd Gitlin, and I think I get a lot of feeling of resonance with the critiques of Christopher Lasch in your analysis of that period in time. And I think that it's still. And this my next question. There's I think a fair amount written today about the kind of the collapse or the absence of the counterculture today, or the kind of sort of
Hmm.
radical transformation of the counterculture. And so, but still, nonetheless, perhaps forms of counterculture leftism are still in a certain tension with the contemporary left. And so I wanted to ask you not so much about how psychedelics plays into that, but maybe more broadly, how you see the legacy of counterculture leftism in these debates that were happening in the new left, and perhaps how that spills over to today, right? I mean, I, for example, wrote a book on the family, and I took a critical position on family abolition. And it's such an interesting example of a form of countercultural leftism. But I actually was different than a lot of critics on the left of family abolition, because I'm like, look, I will debate with family abolition. Like, I'll have a conversation with them. And so it becomes almost like a two ships passing in the night on the left, where you have a kind of counterculture leftism and a more social democratic based leftism. And they don't really, they kind of see each other as antagonistic. And so that has
Yeah.
always, therefore, been a question for me on the left, how to sort of cross that divide. I just want to see how you come at that divide and how you understand it.
No, that's an interesting question. And we're getting into some hairy issues here for sure. Um, I would say since that moment, um, let's say the mid '60s, um, you do see that divide begin to crop up in a lot of different areas. Um, the old class-based social democratic vision that emerged out of the CIO moment in the 1930s. Um, there's a lot of dissent from below with some of its particulars. Um, Certainly, the more radical elements were eliminated from it in the 40s. Um, but I would say, as far as the vision goes, there was something recognizably common to the left, um, that persisted through the '60s, and it persists to today in that social democratic current that you just mentioned. Um, but in the '60s, a different kind of tendency emerged. I mean, you could call it countercultural leftism in a way. Um, I think of it as oftentimes quite maximal in its politics, like lacking in priority of material concerns. Yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot of different ways to describe it, but I would say that it was in a lot of ways born in the 1960s, and born out of a frustration with the progress of American society. I mean, there had been a revolution of sorts in working class living standards, in American life more broadly, and there was some occasion to believe that it was the constraints of what was called big labor or of liberalism itself that were the problem. And I think it was in this environment that, again, what you call countercultural leftism emerged. It seems like there was something to invest ourselves in that weren't just about like the old left demands, but some kind of new prefigurative culture to invest in. And I would say that that tension persists to the present moment. In the left, we're now far afield of drug subcultures, but I think that it's a real division. It's a difficult one um, to talk about sometimes because you know the left at the end of the day is an impotent one, lacking power. Um, I would say headed in the wrong direction in a lot of ways. And so it's kind of silly in one sense to be too critical of the left at a point where it doesn't really have any power to do much of anything. That being said, I do think it's useful to recognize that there are different tendencies on the left,
Yeah.
and that people not only don't agree about things, but sometimes we have diametrically opposed visions of how we're trying to achieve a better world.
I think that's right. I mean, I think it's worth an engagement in the debate, and I think a thinker like Lash can help us navigate that debate to some extent, because part of what Lash is, and this is going to draw me to my next question, is sort of observing about post-war culture in America is a sort of a diminishment in a subjectivity that can have the wherewithal for he writes a lot in The Culture of Narcissism about the crisis of adulthood, for example, or the kind of and even what is it, Amber Lee Frost just yesterday published something in Jacobin about this precise issue. Are millennials caught in a permanent youth stage? Well, this is a common motif, right? And we don't need to bring in any fancy Freudian jargon to describe it. You've written about how this subjectivity is also discussed in the Frankfurt School. So I want to actually bring in a little bit of theory, if we could, at this moment, and sort of ask, because Lash is somebody also who does a genealogy of how the counterculture leftism, where it really emerges, and how it has a certain fetishization of youth, and has a problem with tradition. It sees tradition as somehow inherently reactionary, right? And so it presents a certain theory of reaction, which can be kind of disarming or incoherent to working class people often, and so I guess I don't know if there's a question there, more of an invitation to reflect perhaps on sort of this idea of, and I imagine you're a big reader in Lash as well, and he's come up on my show a lot, and I've interviewed several folks. I actually interviewed his daughter, who writes a lot about counterculture leftism in her own way, Elizabeth Lash Quinn. But perhaps you could bring in psychoanalysis here, and how even, and maybe this is too bold of a question, Ben, and if it is, forgive me, how some of these theories of psychoanalytic critical theory on, subjectivity and things like that might even fit into your bigger argument and quick fixes. I'm asking you to reflect
Yeah.
broadly.
Yeah, it's a good question, and a big one, as you note. In my first book, which was about psychoanalysis and critical social theory, I was trying to um, rethink the first generation critical theorists' understanding of psychoanalytic categories, the ways in which they were deployed, and arguing in part that a different psychoanalytic base would have allowed them to more precisely specify the mechanisms at work in the culture industry and why they thought that was such an important development. And I kind of drift in and out of these discourses at this point. Psychoanalysis, critical social theory, I'm sort of in those worlds, but not really. And so it's been a while since I've discussed some of this. But I would say that what I try to argue in the first book is that what the culture industry and the culture industry thesis, I think, is worth retaining, amidst all the other sort of like critical theory jargon. The idea that something very important happens in the molding of subjects today with the appearance of radio, television, other forms of mass media, I think it's just very important insight, and something that we ought to reckon with, especially at the present moment, when a lot of those mechanisms are breaking down into more niche forms of media consumption, and the process of subject formation that the Frankfurt School was after is really not it's not happening in the way that they theorized. And so I think it's an important thing to foreground. Part of what I try to argue in reconceptualizing the kind of subjectification that happens in the culture industry is to say that what Adorno and Horkheimer were after, in a lot of ways, was a kind of direct death drive gratification. And I go through a lot of work in the book in trying to explain what that means, what is the death drive, a notoriously difficult concept in psychoanalysis, and what it means to gratify it directly. And in that chapter, where I do so, I mean, part of it relies on the prior theory, but the basic idea is that um, it we don't like being ourselves for countless reasons. Having an ego in the psychoanalytic sense is a miserable process. It's something that we resist quite intensely throughout our younger years. And it's something that we only ever take on ambivalently. Like having an ego, having something that puts us in touch with social and physical reality, that's a tremendous gift, right? Otherwise, we're kind of lost, right? The pleasure principle is a nightmare if you don't have some way of adequately channeling it into the real world. But the ego is also something that is constraining and felt that way, and something about which we have great ambivalence. And part of what I want to say the death drive gets at is some kind of elimination of that ego. It's the different ways in which we try to tear down our own selves, our own egos, again in the psychoanalytic sense. And the culture industry provides all sorts of ways in which to do that, all sorts of ways in which to at least temporarily get outside of ourselves, forget about ourselves, no longer attach ourselves to the ego, again in the mature adult sense of the term. And I think that in that way, you could bring in the issue of wild drug consumption in America today. Drugs, perhaps more than television, perhaps more than music, very effectively get at that direct death drive gratification. I think that's what's so terrifying about them, that they don't need to satisfy in terms of higher arts, sublimation, intellectual discourse, right? The kinds of things that we want to see as involved in a good life. Drugs give us that satisfaction without any of that work. And in that sense, they allow us to avoid the experience of having an ego, if only temporarily, and with other sort of consequences, in such a way that is direct and oftentimes very satisfying.
Hmm. Yeah, that's well said. So your suggestion then is that Adorno and Horkheimer were after a kind of model for how to conceive of a way to satisfy this predicament that Freud introduces in 1920 and Beyond the Pleasure Principle of the Death Drive. And we actually have a whole study group that we did on Freud's concept of the death drive. And then we also studied, and the videos are on the page, Byung-Chul Han's really interesting new book called Capitalism and the Death Drive, which folks can look at that material. I want to bring in our final question here, Ben. This has been really interesting to ask you. So if a left, and I'm thinking of Lash here, a thinker that I perceive as somebody who thinks that it is okay to invoke a conception of liberated subjectivity that would be for restraint and moderation and things of that nature, because I think that is interesting when we're talking about drugs, right? Because we certainly don't want to promote some kind of Puritan chaste conception, but nor do we want to promote a pure kind of hedonistic panacea of no. So how do you what are the kind of ethics of the left? Is there a kind of ethical position that the left should take on drugs? Um, in a sense, I think your point would be, as I understand it, is that drugs in themselves are not inherently liberatory, and it's kind of foolish to sort of construe them that way.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure.
Right. Go ahead.
No, in the conclusion of the book, and throughout, really, what I'm trying to argue is that the great American appetite for drugs, as well as the great American desire to unnecessarily vilify drugs, are kind of two sides of the same coin. And this wild alternation between prohibition and peddling, between punitive responses and extreme unjustified enthusiasm for drugs, it's kind of the defining feature of American drug discourse. And it reflects an extreme ambivalence. We love drugs, we absolutely love drugs, and we absolutely hate them at the same time. And so I think that some kind of reckoning with that ambivalence is necessary, and to avoid both poles, to avoid the pole that says drugs are the problem, and also to avoid the pole that says drugs are the solution. And in the conclusion, I say that we should try to approximate what I call a free relationship to drugs, right? In a better society, human beings will absolutely take psychoactive drugs. It's just a feature of human being. We're going to take these things. They are good for us sometimes, but in any event, they're a lot of fun. And hopefully in any better society, we're still having fun. That being said, I think the kinds of reasons for drug consumption would look very different in a better society, right? We wouldn't take them because we're stressed out, because we're anxious, because we feel compelled to escape in some way. We'd take them because we want to explore different facets of our consciousness, and that's a worthwhile goal. But it's not a goal that you can realize unless there are very different material conditions in society. And so that's what I focus on in the end. I wouldn't say it's an ethical response, really, to drug consumption. I would say that it's a kind of materialist challenge. I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which the left gets hooked into debates that it probably shouldn't have strong opinions about, and we get ourselves debating things that either either are unresolvable given present conditions, or we have absolutely no power to influence whatsoever given the fact that we're at the nadir of our power. And so I think that part of the challenge of the book is to say, if you're going to be a rigid materialist about this, you need to go back to material conditions. We can't get roped into either the harm reduction and decriminalization movements as the answer, and we can't get roped into a renewed drug warriorism either. We have to say it's the material conditions, it's jobs, it's housing, it's healthcare, right? These are the things that are going to solve the drug problem insofar as it constitutes a problem. And if we're going to be materialist about it, we need to stay committed to that solution.
Right. And that's something that's not necessarily sexy. So then you then have that confrontation with the maximalist part of the left and the counterculture part of the left, which doesn't construe those demands as liberatory. And I think that in a weird way, psychoanalysis and its sophisticated treatment of like the human subject, what I would try to argue in my writing, and I think maybe you do as well, is that modest demands like that are in fact liberatory. Like that's actually let's have the debate about what constitutes a liberated human or social order, and then may not appear as sexy or radical, but maybe it is. I don't know if that makes sense. It's a sort of debate that we should have on the left in a comradely way. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but
Yeah, I mean, I agree absolutely about having the debate in a comradely way. Um, I think that oftentimes in the absence of political consequences for some of these debates, right? We can get wrapped up in kinds of justifications for different positions that might make sense at a certain ethical level or might make sense at a certain intellectual level that don't oftentimes have bearing on political reality, right? And so, why we would stay focused on material demands rather than range into you know, a wide range of cultural issues that the left is constantly debating. There are sometimes good reasons to have those debates. They can be fun sometimes in the absence of actual power to do anything about this stuff, like podcasts and magazines have to be filled with something, right? And so it's natural that we would go there. I think the question though is one so I think there's two kinds of questions. One, what kind of vision do we want to project that is actually appealing to broad swaths of the population? And, you could say that you leave a lot of things, a lot of questions concerning social justice out when you think in those terms. But I think that just because it's not really about us, it's not really about what the left thinks, but about mobilizing the kinds of forces that would have some kind of political consequences on American society, that it's imperative that the vision projected be broadly appealing, very broadly appealing. And to my mind, the best way to do that is to focus on material concerns. The second thing, though, and I think the more important thing, is to focus on the kinds of ways in which we might begin to exercise or gain strategic leverage to actually impact those debates, right? Um, I I hear people disagreeing violently about all kinds of things that we have absolutely no power to do anything about. And again, it's interesting to hear from an ethical perspective. It's interesting to work through different positions, and I think that in some ways, taking an ethical position is the right thing to do in some cases, and it's the only thing we can do. But until we focus on what are the kinds of things that would allow us to have the leverage to influence some aspect of the political process in a way that points in our direction. And to my mind, the issues, the sort of bread and butter issues that we've just mentioned, jobs, healthcare, housing, et cetera, that would put us in touch with elements in civil society, the labor movement in particular, that would allow us to regain some leverage over the situation. And in the process, begin to be able to affect other kinds of broad social and cultural questions that we're concerned about. So, in both of those ways, I think sometimes the conversations on the left get away from what matters, or like what we might actually begin doing about the things that we're so concerned about.
Yeah. Well, Ben, this has been really wonderful. I want to thank you for coming on my show, and I want to encourage folks to check out this book by Verso, Quick Fixes, which has just come out. This has been really, really interesting, and I enjoyed reading the book a lot. And I wish you the best, and perhaps we'll have you back on to discuss some of your future work. Thanks again.
Cool. Sounds good. Thanks so much for having me.